But the first major story that we want to jump into tonight comes to us from the great state of North Carolina.
Hey folks, I'm Dan McCready. A month ago, I conceded to my opponent Mark Harris in the race for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. But last week, we began to learn about shameful criminal activity bankrolled by my opponent to take away North Carolinians' very rights to vote. I didn't serve overseas in the Marine Corps just to come back home and watch politicians and career criminals attack our democracy. That's why today, I withdraw my concession to Mark Harris, who's remained completely silent. And I call on Mark Harris to tell us exactly what he knew and when he knew it. Join me in this fight for the people whose voices were taken from them.
That was today. Dan McCready, a Democrat, a moderate, a Marine veteran. He ran for Congress this year in North Carolina. And the day after the election, he conceded that he lost that congressional race. Now, that day, it did look like Dan McCready had lost that race, but by less than 1,000 votes. By rights, he could have asked for a recount in that race at that time, but he didn't. Since his concession the day after Election Day, Dan McCready has been silent. He's been publicly silent on the results of that race in North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. But today, as you just saw there in that video that was just released by his campaign, he's not only breaking his silence, he is unconceding the race. I should also tell you that while NBC News had previously called this race for McCready's Republican opponent, Mark Harris, that official NBC call of the race has also now been rescinded. According to NBC News, there is now no call in this race. You've probably seen some of the news about this North Carolina controversy. What has emerged since election night in North Carolina is evidence, pretty broad daylight evidence, of what appears to be a blatant criminal scheme in that district to rig the election for Republican Mark Harris. And as Dan McCready mentioned there in his unconcession video, it really does appear like his opponent, Republican Mark Harris, might have paid for that criminal scheme. But here's the thing that drives me nuts about this North Carolina story. This, for me, has been the single hardest thing to grasp about this story from the very beginning. From when it first emerged that there was something wrong with the result of that congressional race, from when we first heard that the bipartisan election board locally was refusing to certify the results of that race, and they were saying that something was wrong with it. From the very first moment, as far as I'm concerned, the single craziest thing about this race and what happened in this race is that this scheme here, this criminal scheme here, is apparently not a new thing. In that district, specifically in a couple of counties in that district, this has been going on for a while in basically plain sight. And I will prove it. Here's the story for you. As far as I'm concerned, the greatest radio show in the modern history of American radio shows is called This American Life. It is hosted by Ira Glass. If you do not listen to it as a podcast or via your computer, you have probably heard it on your local public radio station. And 2 years ago, at Christmas time, December 23rd in 2016, This American Life did a little story about North Carolina, in which they appear to have stumbled upon this criminal election rigging scheme in this specific district, in this specific part of North Carolina. And again, this wasn't about this current election we've just been through, where there's all this controversy now and all this national news and all this mishigas and today the unconcession. Their story on This American Life about what was going on in North Carolina, this was a couple of years ago.
This American Life, Ira Glass. Our program today, just what I wanted. We've arrived at Act 2 of our program, Act 2. He's making a list, checking it nice, going to find out who voted twice. So this fall, what certain Republicans thought they would discover under the tree was proof of voter fraud.
So that's Ira Glass. That is likely a familiar voice to you. He's the host of This American Life. And you can hear there's like the Christmas theme for this episode of This American Life, because this was just before Christmas 2 years ago in 2016. And This American Life sent a producer down to North Carolina in December 2016. And it wasn't about the presidential election. They sent this producer to North Carolina in the wake of the governor's election in North Carolina in 2016, which was a super close race. In 2016, the incumbent Republican governor of North Carolina was Pat McCrory. He was running for re-election. But in 2016, he lost his seat. A Democrat named Roy Cooper won the governorship instead. But it was super close. And for a long time, the Republican incumbent, Pat McCrory, wouldn't concede that he had lost the governor's race. And in the aftermath of that election in 2016, the North Carolina Republican Party set out to basically try to prove that the Democrats must have cheated, that incumbent Republican Governor Pat McCrory couldn't have lost the election. If it looked like the Democrats had won, it must be because they had somehow rigged it. And that's where This American Life producer Zoe Chase picked up the story. Because North Carolina Republicans went to a specific county in the southeastern part of the state, and they lodged a formal complaint saying that the Democrats in that county had rigged the election, and that's why Pat McCrory lost the governorship. So this radio producer, Zoe Chase, goes to the hearing in that county where the Republicans are lodging this complaint. And then she's there with tape recorders running while the whole thing completely boomerangs. Check this out.
Few hours in, the complaint starts to fall apart in this kind of mortifying way. It happens when the person who actually filed the complaint takes the stand.
How you doing, sir?
Doing fine, Mr. Malcolm.
McCrae Dawes. He takes the stand looking like he's not quite ready for this. Doesn't have a suit, he's got a big beard, skinny guy, windbreaker. And once he's up there being questioned by one of the Democrats on the Board of Elections, he seems amazingly unfamiliar with his own case.
You allege that there's a scheme that was taking place in Bladen County, correct? That's the words that you used. Blatant scheme. What did you mean by that?
A scheme?
You used the words resulting from a
Are you saying
blatant scheme.
I used the words or the attorney that wrote that up used the words?
Well, it's got your signature at the end
Got
of
my
it.
signature on it. But as far as writing that up, I didn't do that. The attorney did. The attorney was the one who drawed the protest up.
He tries to remember who that attorney is, like what his name is.
I can't think of the gentleman's name. It's Steve. I can't remember his last name.
His attorneys seem embarrassed. It is embarrassing when a client who's supposedly lodging a complaint is not familiar with the complaint. They try to object. Doesn't work. McCrae just ignores his lawyers and keeps talking over them.
I told you, right? This is the greatest radio show in the history of radio shows. So this is the story that This American Life is following. Republicans, in the wake of them losing the governorship, they're trying to lodge complaints. They're trying to say Democrats must have stolen that election. Here's why the Republican governor isn't conceding. Democrats had a scheme. We're sure of it. There must be some kind of problems, right? The Democrats must have done something wrong. So they get this local guy in Bladen County, North Carolina, to stand up on behalf of the Republicans and lodge this complaint. And it falls apart. And his complaint goes nowhere. And it is a really big embarrassment in that moment. But then here is the boomerang. Here's how it ends.
The complaint is dismissed, 3-2. Dreams of the perfect Republican Christmas gift melt away. I can't say for sure, but in talking to reporters, election board members, activists, it seems that no one in North Carolina was able to find a single case of true voter fraud, where someone deliberately impersonates someone else, casts a ballot in their name, real fraud, except possibly one case. One. And that one comes out in a very strange twist during the same hearing. Just not where the Republicans were looking. One of the board members starts asking McCrae, their incumbent Republican soil and water supervisor, about whether his side had committed voter fraud.
So you keep saying GOTV. Does that mean you did pay her?
Get out the vote.
Okay. And what exactly was it that she got paid to do?
Here's what tumbles out of McCrae under the board's questioning. He had some people working for him, getting out the vote. Volunteers, McCrae calls them. The volunteers, though, were allegedly getting paid for each ballot they turned in. That is illegal. One of the voters who signed an affidavit said that Get Out the Vote workers came by and had her family request absentee ballots. But then they never received their absentee ballots in the mail like they were supposed to. Then, when the family went to vote on Election Day, they were told they'd already voted. In essence, McCrae is getting accused of paying people to obtain absentee ballots, fill them out, and cast their votes on someone else's behalf. That for sure is illegal. McCrae says he didn't do anything wrong. An election board member then calls for further criminal investigation of what appears to be Republican voter fraud.
I will be making a motion that any and all information that this board has in this possession shall be forwarded to the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina.
This guy gets up there, gets on the microphone, supposedly to lodge a complaint against the Democrats, then admits he has no idea what that complaint even is. But while he's up there, he admits into the microphone that he's been paying people to obtain other people's absentee ballots, to fill them out, and cast those votes on other people's behalf for money. What, is that wrong? I mean, that is what this public radio show, This American Life, discovered 2 years ago in 2016 when they went down to North Carolina to look at the aftermath of that hotly contested governor's race. A guy in southeastern North Carolina, Bladen County, North Carolina, blatantly confessing at a Board of Elections meeting that he had been criminally trying to rig the election for the Republicans. What? What? He not only confessed out loud at that hearing, he confessed on national radio that he was running an organized criminal scheme to steal votes and stuff the ballot box on behalf of Republican candidates in that county. That guy who was caught on tape in that public radio This American Life story 2 years ago, that is the same exact guy who was in the middle of this now national scandal over what appears to be the exact same vote-stealing and ballot-stuffing criminal scheme that he ran exactly the same way in this congressional race, the one that Dan McCready has just unconceded. Because in this congressional election this year, that same guy, the confessed election criminal in North Carolina, he was hired by the Republican congressional candidate in North Carolina's 9th District, Mark Harris. Harris hired him both to win the primary and then to win the general election. This guy was paid by Mark Harris's campaign consultants. He also appears to have been paid directly by the local county Republican Party. And this is all after that guy got up at the local elections board and confessed 2 years ago that, yeah, he pays people to turn in other people's votes. That, yeah, he runs a criminal scheme to rig elections in Bladen County. And Harris hired him, and the local county Republican Party hired him. After this guy admitted that he runs those kinds of schemes, after it aired on national radio, and after he was supposedly referred for prosecution for doing this. So this is what makes me crazy about this story. If the guy was referred for prosecution, how come he was not prosecuted before now? How come he was free to try to rig this election too? This is the part where I mentioned that one of the people he has frequently worked for in previous elections is the local sheriff. Running the same scheme for the local sheriff, including this year. In terms of whether there ought to have maybe been a federal prosecution of this guy, there is a U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of North Carolina. Interestingly, the Trump administration intervened to move him up in the line of succession at the Department of Justice not long ago. I don't know what that U.S. attorney ever did with the criminal referral he supposedly got at least a couple of years ago about this guy confessing to rigging elections in Bladen County, North Carolina. But I can tell you right now that one of the people who that U.S. attorney employs in his office as an assistant U.S. attorney is Mark Harris's son, the son of the Republican candidate, who until recently appeared to have won this congressional seat in part by putting on his payroll this guy who has been openly confessing for a couple of years now that his job, what he gets paid to do, is rigging elections in that part of the state for Republicans. As of tonight, California incumbent Republican Congressman David Valdeo has just conceded his congressional race. He's lost his seat to a Democrat in California named T.J. Cox. With Valdeo's concession tonight, that puts the number of Democratic pickups in the midterm elections at an even 40 seats. But tonight, with Democrat Dan McCready rescinding his concession, and with the criminal scheme that unfolded in the middle of his election now unraveling in plain sight at last, it's not at all clear what's going to happen in North Carolina's 9th District, nor is it at all clear why the guy who did it has never been prosecuted for or stopped from doing this in the past, despite the fact that it was all exposed well before this debacle. Democratic candidate in North Carolina's 9th District, Dan McCready, today unconceded this race. His race is now the last outstanding congressional race in this country. I don't know how it's ever going to get resolved, but Dan McCready joins us for his first national interview since the election next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.